Before ovens had knobs and flour came in neat paper sacks, baking a simple pie was a full-day ordeal of firewood, stone, and prayer. Tonight, let's slip into the year 1250, where flour had to be milled by hand. The crust was tougher than leather, and the kitchen was more smoke than warmth. A humble apple pie meant hours of labor, sharp knives, aching arms, and a little luck with the hearth. Ready to fall asleep to the scent of ash, spice, and ancient effort. If these soft, smoky glimpses into forgotten kitchens help calm your thoughts, dust, I'd love for you to stay. Hit that bell icon and subscribe so you never miss a sleepy journey into the strange comforts of old. Also, what's your favorite bedtime snack? Let me know in the comments. After all, even peasants deserve dessert sometimes. In the year 1250, on a damp autumn morning, when the mist clung to the water like a reluctant spirit, you would find yourself standing beside the great water wheel that powered Aldrich the miller's establishment. The wheel, constructed from oak, timbers that had been seasoned for 7 years, turned with a measured rhythm that had marked the passage of countless days. Each revolution sent a shudder through the wooden gears, a vibration that you could feel in your bones as you watched the ancient process that would transform raw grain into the precious flour needed for your pie. The mill itself was a structure of both engineering marvel and stubborn practicality. Built of local stone with mortar mixed from lime that had been burned in kilns fueled by charcoal, it stood 3 stories tall, each level, serving its purpose in the laborious journey from grain to flour. The ground floor housed the massive millstones, 2 circular discs of imported French burrstone, each weighing nearly a ton. The upper stone, called the runner, rotated above the stationary bedstone, creating the grinding surface that would crush the grain kernels into increasingly finer particles. You would observe Aldrich, his hands permanently stained with flour dust, as he adjusted the gap between the stones with meticulous care. Too close, and the stones would generate heat that would damage the flour, giving it a bitter taste that would ruin any pie. Too far apart, and the grain would pass through partially crushed, creating coarse meal unfit for quality baking. The adjustment was made by turning an iron screw mechanism, a device that required the accumulated wisdom of years to operate properly. The miller's ear was trained to hear the subtle changes in the grinding sound, the whisper of stone against stone, the rustling of grain as it flowed between the surfaces, the occasional crack of a particularly stubborn kernel. The grain itself told a story of the broader medieval economy. Wheat, the preferred grain for quality flour, came from the Lord's domain land, where it was grown using the 3-field system that had revolutionized agricultural productivity. The harvest had been good that year, but not exceptional, the yields averaging 7 to 8 bushels per acre, a respectable return that would feed the community through the winter months. Barley and oats comprised the bulk of the millers, work destined for the coarser breads and porridges that sustained the peasant population. Rye, with its hardy nature and ability to grow in poorer soils, provided insurance against famine, though its flour produced a dark, dense bread that marked its consumers as belonging to the lower social orders. As you watched, a line of peasants formed outside the mill, each carrying sacks of grain that represented weeks of backbreaking labor in the fields. They waited with the patience of those who understood that the mill operated on its own schedule, governed by the flow of water and the availability of the miller's attention. The miller's fee, called multure, was paid in kind, typically 1/16 of the grain brought for grinding. In a year when grain was scarce, this represented a significant portion of a family's sustenance, yet the alternative was to pound grain by hand with mortar and pestle, a process so labor-intensive that it was economically impossible for any but the smallest quantities. The actual grinding process was hypnotically methodical. Grain was poured into a wooden hopper positioned above the runner stone. The flow was controlled by a device called a shoe, a wooden trough that vibrated with the motion of the stones, feeding grain steadily into the eye of the runner stone. As the grain passed between the stones, it was crushed and ground, emerging as flour that was collected in a wooden trough below. The quality of this flour depended on multiple factors: the adjustment of the stones, the moisture content of the grain, the speed of the stones, and the skill of the miller in maintaining consistent conditions throughout the grinding process. Different grades of flour emerged from successive grindings and sievings. The finest flour, called manchet flour, was produced by grinding the grain multiple times and sieving it through increasingly fine cloth. This white flour was reserved for the bread of the wealthy, requiring wheat that had been carefully cleaned and processed. The coarser flours, containing more bran and germ, were destined for the daily bread of common folk. For pie making, the quality of flour determined not only the taste, but the workability of the dough and the final texture of the crust. The miller's work was never simply mechanical. He served as a crucial link in the food chain, possessing knowledge that could make the difference between a successful harvest feeding the community or a poor grinding leaving families hungry. His responsibility extended beyond mere technical competence to encompass the fair distribution of milling services and the maintenance of quality standards that would preserve the grain's nutritional value and baking properties. Yet, as you observed the daily rhythm of the mill, you began to sense the underlying tensions that would shape the remainder of this grinding season. The water level in the mill race had been dropping gradually, a consequence of the unusually dry autumn that followed the harvest. Soon the miller would face the choice between reducing his hours of operation or accepting grain that had been ground less thoroughly. The approaching winter would bring its own challenges, as ice could halt the wheel for weeks at a time, forcing the community to rely on hand grinding or preserved flour stocks. What would become of the carefully planned pie baking when the very foundation of the process, the transformation of grain into flour, hung in such delicate balance with the forces of nature and the demands of an increasingly complex feudal economy? The water level had indeed dropped to concerning levels by the third week of October, and you witnessed Aldrich facing a predicament that would test both his technical expertise and his standing in the community. The mill race, carefully constructed to channel water from the river to the wheel, required a minimum depth to generate sufficient power for grinding. As the autumn progressed without significant rainfall, the water barely reached the bottom paddles of the wheel, causing it to turn sluggishly and reducing the grinding efficiency by nearly half. Standing beside the miller as he examined the situation, you observed the intricate calculations that governed medieval milling. The relationship between water flow, wheel speed, and grinding quality was not simply mechanical, but required constant adjustment based on changing conditions. With reduced water power, the stones turned more slowly, which actually improved the grinding in some ways. The flour remained cooler and retained more of its nutritional properties. However, the reduced throughput meant that the miller could process only a fraction of the grain that awaited grinding, creating a backlog that threatened the community's bread supply. The social implications of this technical problem revealed the complex web of obligations and expectations that defined medieval economic relationships. The miller held his position by grant from the lord of the manor, who had invested substantial resources in constructing and maintaining the mill. In return, all tenants of the manor were required to have their grain ground at the manorial mill, a monopoly that ensured the lord's investment would generate returns through the miller's fees. This system, known as soak, meant that peasants could not simply take their grain elsewhere when faced with delays or reduced service. Aldrich's response to the crisis demonstrated the accumulated wisdom of his craft. Rather than simply grinding grain in the order it arrived, he began to separate the wheat from the coarser grains, giving priority to the wheat that would produce flour suitable for the fine baking required by the manor house and the wealthier merchants in the nearby town. This decision reflected not only practical considerations, but also the social hierarchies that governed medieval life. The quality flour needed for pies and fine bread took precedence over the meal required for peasant porridge, even when the peasants had been waiting longer. The technical aspects of managing reduced water power required adjustments that you could observe in the miller's daily routine. The stones needed to be set closer together to compensate for the slower speed, but this required more frequent monitoring to prevent overheating. The miller found himself working longer hours, constantly adjusting the gap between the stones and monitoring the temperature of the flour as it emerged from the grinding process. His hands, already sensitized by years of work, could detect subtle changes in the texture and warmth of the flour that indicated the need for further adjustments. Economic pressures extended beyond the immediate technical problems. The miller's income depended on the volume of grain processed, and the reduced throughput meant proportionally reduced fees. At the same time, the longer hours required to maintain quality standards increased his costs, particularly for the tallow. Candles needed to work effectively in the dimly lit mill. The mathematics of medieval milling were always precarious, balanced between the need to provide essential services and the requirement to generate sufficient income to maintain the mill and support the miller's family. As the backlog grew, social tensions became increasingly apparent. Peasants who had waited days to have their grain ground began to express frustration, not directly to the miller. Such criticism of a manorial official could result in fines or other penalties, but in the subtle ways that medieval communities registered disapproval. The quality of grain brought for grinding declined as peasants held back their best wheat, hoping for better conditions. Some attempted to supplement their flour supplies by grinding grain at home using querned stones, traditional hand mills that violated the manorial monopoly but provided a practical alternative when the mill could not meet demand. The miller's response to these challenges revealed both his technical competence and his understanding of community dynamics. He began to offer extended hours, working by candlelight to process grain that had accumulated during the day. This extra service came at a cost. The miller charged a premium for evening grinding, justified by the expense of artificial lighting and the disruption to normal schedules. The arrangement satisfied immediate needs while generating additional income, but it also created distinctions between those who could afford the premium service and those who could not. The approaching winter added urgency to the situation. Peasant families needed to build stores of flour that would sustain them through the months when the mill might be frozen or otherwise unavailable. The traditional pattern of milling grain as needed gave way to intensive processing sessions designed to create stockpiles that could be stored in household containers. This shift required different approaches to quality control, as flour intended for storage needed to be ground more thoroughly to prevent spoilage and infestation. Yet even as Aldrich worked to address the immediate crisis, larger questions remained unanswered. The dry autumn suggested that winter water levels might be insufficient for normal operations, potentially forcing the community to rely on more expensive alternatives such as horse-powered mills or hand grinding. The careful balance between technical capability, economic viability, and social obligation that defined medieval milling was being tested by natural conditions beyond anyone's control. How would the community adapt when the fundamental infrastructure of food production failed to meet the basic requirements of daily life? By December of 1250, the miller's fears had materialized into a crisis that would test the resilience of both the milling system and the community it served. The first hard freeze arrived earlier than usual, locking the mill race in a grip of ice that rendered the water wheel completely immobile. You found yourself witnessing a transformation that revealed the true fragility of medieval food production systems and the ingenious adaptations that allowed communities to survive when their primary technology failed. The cessation of water-powered milling created immediate practical problems that rippled through every aspect of the community's food preparation. The reserves of flour that families had accumulated during the autumn months were rapidly depleted, and the remaining grain stores required processing by alternative methods. The miller, faced with the prospect of losing his income entirely, invested in a horse-powered mill, a primitive but effective solution that required significant modifications to his existing equipment. The horse mill consisted of a horizontal wooden wheel connected to a central vertical shaft that drove the grinding stones. Two horses working in shifts walked in a circle around the mechanism, providing the power needed to turn the stones. The setup required careful coordination, as the horses needed to maintain a steady pace to ensure consistent grinding quality. You observed the miller's son, barely 12 years old, learning to manage the horses with the same precision that his father applied to adjusting the millstones. The economics of horse-powered milling were dramatically different from water-powered operations. The cost of maintaining the horses, including fodder, shelter, and veterinary care, was substantial. The miller calculated that the horse mill could process only about 1/3 the volume of grain that the water wheel could handle while operating. Costs were nearly double. These increased expenses were necessarily passed on to customers through higher milling fees, creating additional financial pressure on families already struggling with winter food shortages. The social dynamics of the community shifted as the milling crisis deepened. Peasant families who had previously accepted the manorial monopoly began to form cooperative arrangements for hand grinding, sharing the labor required to process grain, using quern stones. These informal networks operated at the margins of legality, as they technically violated the lord's exclusive rights to grain processing. However, the practical necessity of obtaining flour for daily bread took precedence over legal niceties, and the manor officials found themselves tolerating arrangements that would have been prosecuted under normal circumstances. The quality of bread throughout the community declined as less thoroughly ground flour became the norm. The horse mill, while functional, could not match the fine, consistent grind produced by the properly adjusted water-powered stones. The flour produced contained more bran and exhibited greater variation in particle size, resulting in bread that was coarser in texture and denser in consistency. For pie making, this meant that pastry required different techniques and produced different results than the refined flour that had been available during the autumn months. The winter crisis also revealed the sophisticated knowledge required to maintain flour quality under adverse conditions. The miller developed new techniques for storing grain in conditions of high humidity and fluctuating temperatures, as the horse mill's irregular schedule meant that grain often sat waiting for processing for extended periods. He learned to adjust the stones for different grinding speeds and to compensate for the less consistent power delivery of the horse mill. These adaptations required constant experimentation and fine-tuning, as the feedback mechanisms that governed water-powered milling were absent from the horse-powered system. The community's response to the milling crisis demonstrated both the limitations and the resilience of medieval social organization. While the formal structures of manorial obligation continued to operate, informal networks of mutual assistance developed to supplement the inadequate official services. Families with access to hand-grinding equipment shared their resources with neighbors, creating a parallel system of grain processing that operated alongside the official mill. These arrangements were formalized through reciprocal obligations that would be honored when normal conditions returned. By February, the accumulated Stress of the winter milling crisis had created lasting changes in the community's approach to food production. Families invested in personal grinding equipment, creating redundancy that would reduce their dependence on the manorial mill. The miller diversified his services, offering grain storage and flour trading in addition to his primary milling function. The lord of the manor, recognizing the vulnerability of relying on a single mill, began planning for a second mill that would provide backup capacity during future crises. The spring thaw, when it finally arrived in March, brought both relief and reflection. The water wheel resumed its familiar rhythm, and the efficiency of water-powered milling was restored. However, the experience of the winter crisis had permanently altered the community's understanding of food security and technological dependence. The simple act of grinding grain into flour, previously taken for granted, was now recognized as a complex process requiring backup systems and alternative approaches. The lessons learned during the winter of 1250 would influence milling practices for generations to come. The integration of multiple power sources, the development of cooperative grinding arrangements, and the investment in distributed processing capacity represented adaptations that would make the community more resilient to future disruptions. Yet the fundamental reality remained unchanged. The production of flour suitable for pie making required not only technical expertise, but also the coordination of natural resources, social institutions, and economic systems that operated beyond the control of any individual. The miller's burden was not simply to grind grain, but to maintain the delicate balance between these competing demands that made civilized life possible in medieval society. In the pre-dawn darkness of a winter morning in 1250, you would find yourself in the bakehouse of Master Geoffrey, standing beside young Thomas, whose hands were already flour-dusted despite the early hour. The bakehouse occupied the ground floor of a substantial timber-framed building in the merchant quarter of the town, its thick walls designed to contain the intense heat generated by the brick ovens that were the heart of the baking operation. The air was thick with the scent of yeast and wood smoke, a combination that marked the beginning of each day's transformation of simple ingredients into the bread and pastries that sustained the community. Thomas had been apprenticed to Master Geoffrey for 2 years, bound by a contract that would keep him in service for 5 more years before he could hope to advance to journeyman status. The terms of his apprenticeship were precisely defined by the regulations of the Bakers' Guild, an organization that controlled every aspect of professional baking within the town's boundaries. The Guild's authority extended from the quality of ingredients to the prices charged for finished goods, creating a regulatory framework that ensured consistent standards while protecting the economic interests of established bakers. The apprentice's education began with the most fundamental skill of the baker's craft, the preparation of dough. You observed Thomas as he measured flour with wooden scoops, his movements precise despite the dim light provided by tallow candles. The flour itself told a story of the complex supply chains that supported medieval baking. The finest white flour, ground from wheat that had been sieved multiple times through increasingly fine cloths, was reserved for the bread served at the Lord's table and the pastries sold to wealthy merchants. The coarser flours, containing more bran and germ, were destined for the daily bread of common folk and the sturdy pies that formed the backbone of the bakehouse's production. The transformation of flour into dough required knowledge that was both scientific and intuitive, though the medieval baker would not have understood the distinction. The quality of flour varied with the season, the weather during harvest, and the skill of the miller who had ground it. Thomas learned to assess these variations by touch, feeling the texture of the flour between his fingers and adjusting his techniques accordingly. Winter flour, ground from grain that had been stored for months, required different treatment than the fresh flour available immediately after harvest. The moisture content of the flour affected how much water the dough could absorb, while the protein content determined the structure and texture of the finished bread. The preparation of leavening agents revealed another layer of complexity in medieval baking. Commercial yeast was unknown, so bakers relied on naturally occurring fermentation organisms to make their bread rise. Master Geoffrey maintained several different types of leaven, each adapted to specific baking applications. The most common was barm, the foam skimmed from fermenting ale, which provided active yeasts that could leaven bread dough. The timing of barm collection was crucial, as the yeast organisms were most active during specific stages of the brewing process. For pie crusts, the requirements were different. The hot water pastry technique that Thomas was learning to master involved mixing flour with hot water and lard, creating a dough that was malleable enough to shape but strong enough to support heavy fillings. The temperature of the water was critical. Too hot, and the dough would become tough and difficult to work. Too cool, and it would lack the plasticity needed for proper shaping. The apprentice learned to judge the correct temperature by touch, a skill that required months of practice to develop reliably. The seasonal rhythm of the bakehouse was intimately connected to the agricultural calendar and the religious observances that structured medieval life. During Lent, when church regulations prohibited the consumption of meat, eggs, and dairy products, the bakehouse focused on producing bread and pastries that complied with fasting requirements. This meant using vegetable oils instead of lard, omitting eggs from enriched breads, and creating sweet pastries that relied on honey and spices rather than butter and cream. The technical challenges of fast-day baking required different approaches to dough preparation and presented opportunities for innovation within the constraints of religious law. The guild regulations that governed Thomas's training were remarkably detailed, specifying not only the techniques that apprentices must master, but also the standards of behavior expected from those who would eventually become master bakers. The apprentice was forbidden from revealing trade secrets to competitors, required to maintain the reputation of his master's establishment, and expected to demonstrate loyalty and diligence in all aspects of his work. Violations of these expectations could result in extension of the apprenticeship period or, in severe cases, expulsion from the guild system entirely. The economic aspects of apprenticeship were equally complex. Thomas received no wages during his training, but his master was obligated to provide food, shelter, and clothing in addition to instruction in the baker's craft. This arrangement represented a significant investment for the master baker, who had to support the apprentice for years before receiving any economic benefit from his labor. The system worked because experienced apprentices eventually became valuable contributors to the bakehouse operation, capable of performing complex tasks with minimal supervision. As Thomas worked through the early morning hours preparing dough that would be shaped into loaves and pies throughout the day, you could observe the gradual development of skills that would define his adult livelihood. The seemingly simple task of mixing flour and water revealed layers of complexity that required not only technical competence but also an understanding of the natural processes that transformed raw ingredients into finished goods. The apprentice's hands were developing the sensitivity needed to detect subtle variations in dough consistency, while his mind was absorbing the accumulated wisdom of generations of bakers who had perfected these techniques through centuries of practice. Yet even as Thomas mastered the fundamental skills of dough preparation, questions remained about the challenges that would define his future in the baker's craft. The guild system that provided structure and security for established bakers also created barriers for those seeking to advance within the profession. What would it take for Thomas to progress from apprentice to journeyman and eventually to master baker with his own establishment? As the winter morning progressed, Thomas's education moved from the preparation of dough to the far more dangerous and complex art of managing the bakehouse ovens. The transition from apprentice to skilled baker required not only technical knowledge, but also the courage to work with fires that could destroy the building and everyone in it if improperly controlled. You found yourself witnessing a process that combined ancient techniques with sophisticated understanding of heat, timing, and the physics of combustion. The bakehouse contained 3 ovens of different sizes, each designed for specific types of baking. The largest oven, constructed from fire-resistant brick imported from regions known for their clay deposits, was used for bread baking and could accommodate dozens of loaves simultaneously. The medium oven was reserved for pastries and pies, where more precise temperature control was essential. The smallest oven, barely large enough for a single batch of delicate items, was used for the fine pastries that commanded premium prices from wealthy customers. The process of heating the ovens began hours before baking could commence. Thomas learned to build fires directly inside the oven chambers using carefully selected wood that would burn cleanly without imparting unwanted flavors to the bread. Oak was preferred for its steady burning characteristics and neutral taste, while fruitwoods were reserved for special occasions when their subtle flavors would enhance the finished product. The apprentice's understanding of different wood types and their burning properties was essential knowledge that separated skilled bakers from amateurs. Temperature control in medieval ovens required techniques that were both precise and intuitive. The bakers had no thermometers, so they relied on visual and tactile cues to determine when the ovens reached the proper temperature for different types of baking. Thomas learned to observe the color of the oven walls, which changed from black to gray to white as the temperature increased. He practiced testing temperature by throwing flour into the oven and timing how quickly it browned, a technique that provided remarkably accurate temperature estimates for experienced practitioners. The firing process itself was a carefully choreographed procedure that required constant attention. The initial fire had to be large enough to heat the massive thermal mass of the oven walls, but controlled enough to prevent the flames from reaching dangerous heights. As the fire burned, the apprentice learned to read the smoke patterns that indicated proper combustion. Clean burning smoke meant the fire was receiving adequate oxygen, while dark, thick smoke suggested incomplete combustion that could deposit soot on the oven walls and contaminate the food. Once the ovens reached the proper temperature, the coals and ashes had to be removed completely before baking could begin. This process, known as clearing the oven, required special long-handled tools and techniques that minimized the baker's exposure to the intense heat. Thomas learned to sweep the oven floor with damp cloths attached to long poles, removing every trace of ash that could affect the taste of the bread. The cleared oven retained heat in its massive walls, providing the steady, radiant heat needed for proper baking. The loading of the ovens required skills that were both athletic and artistic. Bread loaves had to be placed quickly and efficiently while the oven door was open, minimizing heat loss while ensuring even spacing for proper air circulation. Thomas practiced with a long-handled wooden peel, learning to slide loaves onto the oven floor with movements that were both swift and precise. The timing was critical. Too much delay resulted in uneven baking as the oven temperature dropped, while rushed placement could result in damaged loaves or burns to the baker. Different types of baking required different approaches to oven management. Bread baking took advantage of the highest temperatures, with loaves placed in the oven immediately after clearing. As the temperature gradually declined, the oven became suitable for pastries and pies, which required more moderate heat. The final stage of the baking cycle was reserved for items that required slow, gentle cooking, such as the meat pies that would simmer for hours in the gradually cooling oven. The economic implications of oven management were substantial. Fuel was expensive, and the cost of heating the ovens had to be recovered through the sale of baked goods. Master Geoffrey taught Thomas to calculate the optimal loading of each oven to maximize the return on fuel investment while maintaining quality standards. This required understanding not only the baking requirements of different products, but also the market demand for various types of bread and pastries. The Guild regulations governing oven operation reflected both safety concerns and quality standards. Bakers were required to maintain their ovens in safe condition, with regular inspections by Guild officials who had the authority to shut down operations that posed fire hazards. The Guild also enforced standards for the types of fuel that could be used, prohibiting materials that could produce toxic fumes or contaminate food. These regulations represented a form of early industrial safety code that protected both workers and consumers. The dangers of oven operation were ever present. Burns were common occupational hazards, and the apprentice learned to work with clothing and equipment designed to minimize injury. Thick leather aprons provided protection from radiant heat, while long-handled tools kept hands and arms away from the flames. The bakehouse maintained supplies of burn remedies, including honey and herbal preparations that could treat minor injuries without interrupting the baking schedule. Thomas's progression in oven management was closely monitored by Master Geoffrey, who recognized that the apprentice's safety and the bakehouse's reputation both depended on competent fire handling. The young man learned to work with speed and precision, but also with the respect for fire that came from understanding its destructive potential. The transformation of raw dough into finished bread required not only technical skill, but also the courage to work with forces that could not be completely controlled. As the day's baking progressed, Thomas began to understand that mastery of the ovens represented more than technical competence. The ability to manage fire safely and effectively was a form of power that set professional bakers apart from household cooks. The Guild's control over oven technology was one of the mechanisms that maintained the economic viability of professional baking, creating barriers to entry that protected established bakers from competition. Yet this same system that provided security for Guild members also created challenges for apprentices seeking to establish their own businesses. The spring of 1251 brought Thomas to a crucial juncture in his apprenticeship, as Master Geoffrey began to evaluate whether the young man possessed the skills and character necessary to advance within the Guild hierarchy. The assessment process was both formal and informal, involving not only demonstrated technical competence, but also evidence of the commercial understanding and social standing required for eventual master status. You witnessed a process that revealed the complex interplay between craft knowledge, economic opportunity, and social mobility in medieval urban society. The formal evaluation began with a series of practical tests administered by Guild officials, who visited the bakehouse during normal working hours to observe Thomas's performance under real conditions. The apprentice was required to demonstrate his mastery of every aspect of the baking process, from the initial assessment of flour quality to the final presentation of finished products. The examiners paid particular attention to his ability to work independently, making decisions about timing, temperature, and technique without constant supervision from Master Geoffrey. One of the most challenging tests involved the preparation of a complex meat pie that required integration of multiple skills. Thomas had to prepare hot water pastry dough, season and cook the filling, manage oven temperatures for proper baking, and present a finished product that met Guild standards for both appearance and taste. The test was designed to evaluate not only technical competence but also the apprentice's ability to coordinate multiple processes simultaneously, a skill essential for independent operation of a bakehouse. The economic aspects of the examination were equally important. Thomas was required to calculate the cost of ingredients, estimate the time required for production, and propose a selling price that would provide reasonable profit while remaining competitive with other Guild members. This exercise revealed his understanding of the business principles that govern professional baking, including the relationship between ingredient costs, labor time, and market demand. The Guild's evaluation also encompassed character assessment, as the organization was concerned with maintaining its reputation and the integrity of its members. Thomas's behavior during his apprenticeship was reviewed, including his punctuality, reliability, and respectful treatment of customers and colleagues. The guild officials interviewed Master Geoffrey and other established bakers who had worked with the apprentice, seeking evidence of the personal qualities that would make Thomas a trustworthy member of the professional community. The financial requirements for advancement presented the most significant obstacle for many apprentices. Progression to journeyman status required payment of substantial fees to the guild, including entrance fees, examination costs, and contributions to the guild's mutual assistance fund. For Thomas, whose family background was modest, these requirements represented months of wages that he had not yet earned. The guild's financial barriers served to limit membership to those who had either family resources or the patronage of wealthy sponsors. Master Geoffrey's role in Thomas's advancement was crucial, as the master's recommendation carried significant weight with guild officials. The relationship between master and apprentice involved complex calculations of mutual benefit and obligation. The master had invested years in training Thomas, providing not only instruction but also food, shelter, and clothing. In return, the master expected loyalty and the continuation of business relationships that would benefit both parties after the apprentice's advancement. The guild's decision-making process reflected the organization's dual role as both professional, association, and economic cartel. The guild members had incentives to maintain high standards that protected their collective reputation, but they also sought to limit competition by restricting the number of new members admitted to master status. The evaluation of apprentices thus involved balancing the need for qualified bakers against the desire to preserve the economic advantages of guild membership. The outcome of Thomas's evaluation was influenced by factors beyond his individual performance. The guild considered the current market conditions for baked goods, the number of existing bakeries in the town, and the anticipated demand for additional baking capacity. During periods of economic growth, the guild was more likely to admit new members, while economic downturns led to more restrictive admission policies. The social implications of guild membership extended beyond the immediate benefits of professional recognition. Guild members participated in religious observances, charitable activities, and civic functions that provided social status and political influence within the urban community. The guild's meeting hall served as a center for social interaction among bakers and their families, creating networks of mutual support that extended beyond purely commercial relationships. Thomas's advancement to journeyman status, when it finally came, opened new possibilities but also presented new challenges. As a journeyman, he could work for wages in any guild bakery, but he could not establish his own business or train apprentices. The path to master status required additional years of experience, the accumulation of capital needed to establish a bakehouse, and the political skills necessary to navigate the guild's complex internal dynamics. The guild system that had provided structure and security for Thomas's training also created constraints that would shape his future career. The regulations that ensured quality standards and protected established bakers from unfair competition also limited opportunities for innovation and entrepreneurship. The young baker found himself part of a system that was both supportive and restrictive, providing economic security at the cost of individual freedom. The transformation of Thomas from apprentice to journeyman represented more than personal advancement. It reflected the broader process by which medieval society transmitted specialized knowledge from one generation to the next. The guild system ensured that the skills required for professional baking would be preserved and refined, but it also created social hierarchies that determined who could participate in the urban economy and under what conditions. As Thomas began his career as a journeyman baker, he carried with him not only the technical knowledge acquired during his apprenticeship, but also an understanding of the social and economic forces that governed his profession. The ability to bake a perfect pie was only the beginning of his education. The greater challenge was learning to navigate the complex web of relationships and obligations that defined life within the guild system and medieval urban society. In the autumn of 1250, as you stood in the solar of Lady Marguerite's manor house, watching the careful inventory of spices that had arrived with the latest caravan from London, you witnessed transactions that represented fortunes risked and won across the known world. The small wooden boxes and leather pouches arrayed on the oak table contained substances so valuable that they were weighed against silver coins, their prices fluctuating with reports of distant wars, shipwrecks, and the success or failure of harvests in lands that existed only in the imagination of most Europeans. Master Edmund, the spice merchant, had travelled from London with a train of pack horses, their loads carefully distributed and guarded by armed men who understood that the modest-looking packages they protected were worth more than the annual income of entire villages. The merchant's ledger, written in the careful script of a man who understood that a single error could mean financial ruin, recorded prices that revealed the economic realities of the medieval spice trade. Black pepper, the most common of the exotic spices, cost 12 pence per pound, equivalent to the daily wages of a skilled craftsman for nearly 2 weeks. Cinnamon commanded twice that price, while saffron, the most precious of all spices, sold for more than its weight in gold. The spices themselves told stories of journeys that spanned continents and cultures. The black pepper had begun its journey in the western Ghats of India, where it grew wild on vines that climbed the trees of monsoon forests. Harvested by local collectors who understood the precise timing required to capture the berries at their peak potency, the pepper had travelled by cart and riverboat to ports on the Malabar coast. From there, Arab merchants had loaded it onto dhows that carried it across the Arabian Sea to the trading centres of the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. The cinnamon that Lady Marguerite examined with such care had travelled even farther, beginning its journey on the island of Ceylon, where it grew as the inner bark of specific trees that required particular climatic conditions to produce the aromatic compounds that made it so valuable. The harvesting process was itself a specialized craft, requiring knowledge of which trees to select, when to strip the bark, and how to process it into the quills that would preserve its flavor during the long journey to European markets. Saffron represented perhaps the most remarkable story of all. Each small thread was the stigma of a crocus flower hand-harvested during a brief window when the flowers bloomed in the mountains of Kashmir and other distant regions. It took over 150 flowers to produce a single gram of saffron, and the harvesting had to be completed within hours of the flowers opening to capture the full intensity of color and flavor. The precious threads were then dried and packed with meticulous care, as exposure to light or moisture could destroy their value entirely. Lady Marguerite's kitchen represented the culmination of trade networks that stretched across the known world. The manor's wealth, derived from productive agricultural lands and strategic political alliances, was sufficient to support the luxury of exotic spices, but even for a household of her standing, the purchase represented a significant investment. The spices would be used sparingly, their precious flavors reserved for the most important occasions and the most honored guests. The economics of the spice trade revealed the complex calculations that governed medieval commerce. Master Edmund had invested his entire fortune in the goods that now lay before Lady Marguerite, gambling that he could sell them at prices sufficient to cover his costs and provide a profit adequate to justify the risks he had undertaken. The journey from London had required payment of tolls at river crossings and town gates, fees for armed guards, and compensation for the pack-horse drivers who had transported his valuable cargo over roads that were little more than muddy tracks during the autumn rains. The political dimensions of the spice trade were equally complex. The Crusades had opened new routes to the east, but they had also created instabilities that could disrupt commerce without warning. The Mongol conquests were beginning to create new possibilities for overland trade, but European merchants were only beginning to understand the implications of these distant events. The spice trade operated at the intersection of multiple political systems, each with its own currencies, laws, and customs that had to be navigated successfully for commerce to flourish. Lady Marguerite's examination of the spices was itself a skilled performance that revealed her understanding of quality indicators that separated premium goods from inferior substitutes. She tested the black pepper by crushing a few corns between her fingers, evaluating the intensity of the aroma and the sharpness of the flavor. The cinnamon was assessed by its color, flexibility, and the sweetness of its scent. The saffron threads were examined individually, their deep red color and distinctive fragrance confirming their authenticity and quality. The seasonal timing of spice purchases reflected both practical and economic considerations. Lady Marguerite was planning for the Christmas celebrations that would require elaborate preparations and the display of wealth that was expected of her social position. The spices would be used to prepare dishes that would demonstrate her household's prosperity and her own sophistication in matters of cuisine. The investment in spices was thus not simply a matter of culinary preference, but a form of social communication that reinforced her family's standing within the aristocratic hierarchy. The storage and preservation of spices required specialized knowledge and equipment. Lady Marguerite's pantry contained wooden chests lined with lead to protect against moisture and insects, while smaller quantities were kept in ceramic jars sealed with wax to preserve their potency. The kitchen staff had been trained in the careful handling of these precious substances, understanding that waste or spoilage could represent significant financial losses. As the negotiations between Lady Marguerite and Master Edmund continued, the conversation revealed the personal relationships that underlied medieval commerce. The merchant's success depended not only on his ability to obtain quality goods at reasonable prices, but also on his reputation for honest dealing and his understanding of his customers' needs and preferences. Lady Marguerite, in turn, depended on merchants like Edmund to provide access to the luxury goods that were essential to maintaining her social position. The arrival of the spice merchant marked the beginning of intensive preparations that would transform Lady Marguerite's kitchen into a center of culinary creativity. Yet the precious substances that made this transformation possible carried with them questions about the human costs of the trade networks that brought them to her table and the social implications of a system that reserved such luxuries for the wealthy, while the majority of the population subsisted on basic foods that required no exotic seasonings. Within the stone walls of Lady Marguerite's kitchen, the precious spices were transformed through techniques that represented centuries of accumulated culinary wisdom passed down through generations of cooks who understood the delicate art of combining exotic flavors with local ingredients. You observed as Master Cook Robert, a man whose reputation extended throughout the region, began the complex process of preparing the elaborate pies that would grace the Lord's table during the upcoming feast, celebrating the Feast of St. Andrew. Dor's kitchen itself was a marvel of medieval engineering designed to support the complex culinary operations required by a great household. The central hearth, constructed from local stone and lined with fire-resistant clay, provided multiple cooking surfaces at different temperatures. Smaller braziers allowed for precise heat control needed for delicate sauce preparation, while the great cauldrons suspended from iron chains could accommodate the large quantities required for feeding the extended household. The kitchen's high ceiling and carefully designed ventilation system managed the smoke and heat generated by multiple fires burning simultaneously. Master Robert's approach to spice usage revealed both the scientific understanding and the artistic sensibility that distinguished professional cooks from household servants. Each spice possessed specific characteristics that determined how and when it should be employed. Black pepper provided heat and pungency that enhanced meat dishes, but it had to be added at precisely the right moment to avoid bitterness. Cinnamon contributed sweetness and warmth that complemented both savory and sweet preparations, but excessive quantities could overwhelm more delicate flavors. The preparation of the pie filling demonstrated the complex layering of flavors that characterized elite medieval cuisine. Master Robert began with joints of beef and venison, meats that had been selected for their quality and aged to develop the proper texture and flavor. The meat was cut into uniform pieces and seasoned with salt, the most basic but essential of all seasonings. The initial seasoning was allowed to penetrate the meat while other preparations continued, a process that required careful timing to ensure optimal flavor development. The spice mixture that would define the pie's character was prepared through a process that combined measurement with intuition. Master Robert worked from recipes that had been refined through years of experience, but he also adjusted proportions based on the specific characteristics of the ingredients at hand. The black pepper was freshly ground using a mortar made from marble imported from quarries known for their hard, dense stone. The grinding process itself was carefully controlled, as different degrees of fineness produced distinct flavor profiles. Ginger provided complexity that complemented the pepper's heat with its own distinctive warmth and slight sweetness. The ginger root was scraped clean and grated, using tools designed specifically for the purpose, as the fibrous texture of the root required special handling to extract maximum flavor while avoiding unpleasant stringiness in the finished dish. The timing of ginger addition was crucial, as prolonged cooking could diminish its potency, while insufficient cooking left it harsh and overpowering. The most precious spices were reserved for the final stages of preparation, where their distinctive characteristics could be preserved and showcased. Saffron was steeped in warm wine to extract its color and flavor, creating a golden liquid that would transform both the appearance and taste of the pie filling. The process required precise timing, as oversteeping could extract bitter compounds, while understeeping failed to capture the saffron's full potential. Cinnamon was added in carefully measured quantities, its sweet warmth providing a counterpoint to the meat's richness and the pepper's heat. Master Robert used cinnamon bark rather than ground cinnamon, removing the bark before serving to avoid textural issues while maximizing flavor extraction during the cooking process. The bark was scored to release its essential oils, a technique that required understanding of the spice's structure and properties. The cooking process itself was a carefully orchestrated performance that required constant attention and adjustment. The pie filling was cooked in stages, with different ingredients added at precisely timed intervals to ensure optimal flavor development. The initial browning of the meat created complex flavors through the Maillard reaction, though medieval cooks understood this phenomenon through experience rather than scientific theory. The addition of wine and other liquids created steam that helped tenderize the meat while extracting flavors from the spices. The sauce that bound the pie filling represented perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the preparation. Medieval cooks created rich, complex sauces through techniques that anticipated many modern culinary methods. Stock was prepared from bones and vegetable trimmings, simmered for hours to extract maximum flavor and body. The stock was then reduced and enriched with additional ingredients, creating a base that could support the delicate spice flavors without overwhelming them. The economic calculations underlying spice usage were never far from Master Robert's mind. Each pinch of saffron represented a significant cost that had to be justified by the results achieved. The cook's reputation depended on his ability to create memorable dishes while managing expenses in ways that demonstrated both culinary skill and economic responsibility. Waste was not merely inefficient but potentially disastrous for both the cook's career and the household's finances. The seasonal availability of ingredients required constant adaptation and creativity. Master Robert worked with preserved meats, dried fruits and stored vegetables, transforming these basic ingredients through the alchemy of spices into dishes that could compete with the finest preparations available during the harvest season. The spices provided not only flavor but also the psychological impact of luxury and sophistication that distinguished aristocratic cuisine from peasant food. The preparation of multiple courses simultaneously tested the organizational skills that separated master cooks from their assistants. Master Robert coordinated the efforts of several kitchen servants, each responsible for specific aspects of the meal preparation. The timing had to be precise, as all courses needed to reach the proper temperature and flavor development at the same moment. The complexity of this orchestration increased exponentially with the addition of exotic spices, as each required different handling techniques and timing considerations. As the pie filling neared completion, Master Robert began the critical process of taste adjustment, using his educated palate to balance the various flavor elements. This final tuning required not only technical knowledge but also artistic sensibility, as the goal was to create harmony among potentially conflicting tastes and aromas. The process could not be rushed as flavors continued to develop and change throughout the cooking process, requiring constant monitoring and adjustment. Yet even as the kitchen filled with the intoxicating aromas of exotic spices and carefully prepared meats, questions remained about the broader implications of such elaborate culinary displays. The precious spices that created these magnificent flavors represented not only culinary achievement, but also the economic and social systems that made such luxury possible for a few while remaining forever beyond the reach of the many. The completion of Lady Marguerite's spiced pies coincided with the arrival of guests whose presence would transform the evening meal into a complex social performance, where culinary excellence served as both entertainment and political communication. You witnessed the final preparations as the manor house transformed itself into a stage for the display of wealth, power, and sophisticated taste that defined aristocratic culture in medieval society. The guest list represented a careful calculation of political alliances and social obligations. Lord William, a neighbouring baron whose support was essential for Lady Marguerite's family's continued prosperity, had accepted her invitation along with his wife and their retinue of knights and servants. The bishop of the local diocese, whose spiritual authority carried significant temporal power, would provide religious legitimacy to the gathering while advancing his own political interests. Several wealthy merchants from the nearby town completed the guest list, their presence acknowledging the economic relationships that increasingly shaped aristocratic life. The presentation of the spiced pies required choreography that was as carefully planned as a military campaign. Master Robert supervised the arrangement of dishes that would demonstrate both the kitchen's technical competence and the household's access to the finest ingredients. The pies were presented on silver platters that had been polished to mirror brightness, their surfaces reflecting the light from dozens of candles that illuminated the great hall. The visual impact was calculated to inspire awe and admiration, establishing the host's status before the first bite was taken. The service of the meal followed protocols that were both ancient and evolving, reflecting the changing nature of aristocratic culture in the 13th century. The guests were seated according to a hierarchy that acknowledged both their social rank and their political importance to Lady Marguerite's family. The most honored guests occupied positions closest to the host's table, while lesser figures were arranged in order of decreasing importance. This seating arrangement communicated subtle messages about alliance, favor, and expectation that were understood by all participants. The presentation of each course was accompanied by ritual that transformed eating into ceremony. Servants trained in the complex protocols of aristocratic service carried the dishes with movements that emphasized both the food's value and the household's sophistication. The carving of meat was performed by skilled attendants, whose techniques displayed the quality of the ingredients while creating portions appropriate to each guest's status. The spiced pies, representing the culmination of days of preparation and substantial financial investment, were presented with particular ceremony that acknowledged their special significance. The guests' reactions to the spiced dishes provided immediate feedback on the success of Lady Marguerite's investment in exotic seasonings. Lord William's evident appreciation for the complex flavors demonstrated his own sophistication while confirming the host's success in providing appropriate hospitality. The bishop's blessing of the meal acknowledged both its material excellence and its spiritual significance as an expression of gratitude for divine abundance. The merchants' obvious enjoyment of dishes they could afford but rarely experienced reinforced the social distinctions that the feast was designed to communicate. The conversation during the meal revealed the multiple functions that such gatherings served in medieval society. Business relationships were negotiated through indirect communication that used courtesy and hospitality as vehicles for more serious discussions. Political alliances were explored and reinforced through the shared experience of luxury that created bonds of mutual obligation. Social hierarchies were both displayed and subtly challenged as guests maneuvered for position within the complex web of relationships that defined their world. The economic implications of the feast extended far beyond the immediate costs of ingredients and preparation. Lady Marguerite's demonstration of wealth and sophistication would influence her family's political and commercial relationships for months to come. The guests' favourable impressions would translate into concrete benefits. Lord William's support in potential conflicts, the bishop's favour in ecclesiastical matters, and the merchant's preferential treatment in commercial transactions. The spices that had seemed so expensive when purchased from Master Edmund now appeared as wise investments that would generate returns far exceeding their cost. The cultural significance of the elaborate meal reflected broader changes in medieval society that were transforming the nature of aristocratic life. The increasing availability of luxury goods through expanding trade networks created new opportunities for display and competition among the elite. The growing sophistication of culinary techniques allowed for more elaborate expressions of wealth and taste. The rise of urban centers and merchant classes created new audiences for aristocratic display while providing the economic foundation that made such displays possible. The preservation of the feast's memory became as important as the event itself. The guests would carry stories of the evening's magnificence to their own social circles, extending Lady Marguerite's reputation far beyond those who had actually attended. The servants who had participated in the preparation and service would remember the techniques and standards they had observed, carrying this knowledge to future positions where it would influence other households' practices. The recipes and methods used to create the spiced dishes would be recorded and transmitted, becoming part of the accumulated culinary wisdom that defined elite cuisine. The contrasts between the feast's luxury and the daily reality of most people's lives were not lost on contemporary observers. The spices that flavored Lady Marguerite's pies represented more wealth than most peasant families would see in their lifetimes. The single meal's cost could have fed dozens of people for weeks, raising questions about the moral implications of such displays, while the majority of the population struggled to obtain basic nutrition. These contradictions were acknowledged through religious teachings about charity and social responsibility, but they were rarely allowed to interfere with the practical realities of maintaining social position and political power. As the evening concluded with the final removal of dishes and the departure of guests, Lady Marguerite could assess the success of her investment in exotic spices and elaborate preparation. The immediate goals had been achieved, relationships had been strengthened, status had been demonstrated, and obligations had been fulfilled. The longer-term benefits would become apparent in the weeks and months to come as the political and economic advantages generated by the evening's display of hospitality began to materialize. Yet the questions raised by such elaborate consumption remained unanswered. The global trade networks that brought precious spices to Lady Marguerite's table extracted wealth from distant lands while concentrating it in the hands of European elites. The social systems that made such displays possible depended on the labor of peasants and servants whose own access to luxury remained severely limited. The feast that had seemed so magnificent in the candlelit Great Hall appeared more problematic when viewed against the broader context of medieval society's fundamental inequalities. The transformation of simple ingredients into elaborate dishes through the alchemy of exotic spices represented both human ingenuity and social hierarchy, creativity and exploitation, cultural achievement and moral ambiguity. The pies that had graced Lady Marguerite's table embodied all of these contradictions, serving as symbols of medieval society's capacity for both remarkable sophistication and profound injustice. In the dim light of a February morning in 1251, you would find yourself crouched beside the central hearth of Godwin the peasant's cottage, watching as his wife Aldith carefully measured the precious ingredients that would become their family's weekly attempt at pie-making. The cottage, constructed from oak timber, felled on the Lord's land and filled with wattle and daub mixed from local clay and straw, represented generations of accumulated poverty that had taught its inhabitants to extract maximum value from the most modest resources. The hearth itself occupied the center of the single room that served as kitchen, dining hall, workshop, and sleeping quarters for Godwin, Aldith, and their 3 surviving children. Built from stones gathered from the Lord's fields during the annual stone picking that preceded each year's ploughing, the hearth was surrounded by a circle of hard-packed earth that had been worn smooth by decades of cooking activities. Above, a simple opening in the thatched roof allowed smoke to escape, though much of it lingered in the rafters, preserving the thatch while creating the perpetual haze that marked peasant dwellings throughout the medieval countryside. Aldith's ingredients represented the carefully hoarded surplus from months of subsistence agriculture and strategic foraging. The flour, ground from barley rather than wheat, had been purchased from the manorial mill using grains saved from their own harvest allocation. The quality was coarse, containing significant quantities of bran and the occasional fragment of stone from the millstones, but it would serve to create a dough that could hold together long enough to contain their precious filling. The cost of milling had consumed a significant portion of their grain stores, but the alternative, pounding grain by hand with wooden mortars, was too labor-intensive for regular use. The fat that would bind the dough came not from the lard used by wealthy households, but from the rendered fat of their single pig, an animal that represented both their most valuable possession and their primary source of protein for the winter months. The pig had been slaughtered in November, when the cold weather would preserve the meat, and every portion had been utilized with meticulous care. The choicest cuts had been salted and stored for special occasions, while lesser portions had been ground into sausages or preserved in the animal's own fat. Even the blood had been saved and made into puddings that would provide essential nutrition during the lean months of late winter. Water for the dough came from the village well, a communal resource that required careful management to prevent contamination and ensure adequate supply for all households. Aldith had drawn water before dawn, when the well would be less crowded and the water clearest after the night's settling. The water had to be heated over the fire, a process that consumed precious fuel and required careful attention to prevent boiling, which would make the dough tough and difficult to work. The preparation of the dough required techniques adapted to the limitations of peasant kitchens. Without the wooden bowls and specialized utensils available to professional bakers, Aldith mixed the dough in a shallow wooden trough that served multiple purposes in the household economy. The trough was used for kneading bread, preparing animal feed, and washing clothes requiring thorough cleaning between uses. The mixing process itself was more laborious than in wealthy kitchens, as the coarse flour absorbed water unevenly and required extended kneading to develop adequate structure. The key filling for their pie represented the culmination of months of careful resource management and seasonal planning. The base consisted of dried peas that had been saved from the previous year's harvest, soaked overnight to soften, and cooked until tender. Peas provided essential protein and could be stored for extended periods without spoilage, making them a crucial element in peasant nutrition during the winter months. The cooking process required constant attention, as burnt peas were inedible and wasted precious fuel. Supplementing the peas were small quantities of preserved meat from various sources. Bacon from their pig provided the richest flavor and highest fat content, but it was used sparingly to make their limited supply last through the winter. A few strips of dried mutton obtained through barter with a neighbor whose sheep had died during the autumn storms added different flavors and textures. Even the preserved remains of poultry, chickens that had stopped laying eggs and were too old for productive breeding, contributed to the filling, though their tough meat required long, slow cooking to become palatable. Wild ingredients gathered during the autumn months provided both flavor and nutrition that would otherwise be unavailable to the peasant household. Mushrooms that had been dried and stored provided earthy flavors that enhanced the meat, while wild onions and herbs added complexity that partially compensated for the lack of expensive spices. Oldith's knowledge of edible wild plants represented crucial survival skills that had been passed down through generations of women who understood the difference between subsistence and starvation. The seasonings available to peasant cooks were limited but carefully employed to maximize their impact. Salt, when available, was used sparingly and primarily for preservation rather than flavoring. More commonly, peasant cooking relied on herbs that could be grown in cottage gardens or gathered from wild sources. Dried sage provided a pungent flavor that worked well with meat, while thyme and other herbs added complexity without significant cost. Even the ashes from certain plants could provide alkaline flavoring that enhanced other ingredients. The fuel for cooking represented another significant constraint on peasant culinary activities. Wood was increasingly scarce as forests were cleared for agriculture and peasants were restricted in their access to timber from the lord's forests. Aldith collected dead branches, dried grass, and other combustible materials during her daily activities, building a fuel supply that had to last through the cooking process. The fire had to be managed carefully to provide adequate heat for cooking while conserving fuel for other essential activities. The cooking process itself required techniques adapted to the limitations of peasant hearths. Without ovens, pies had to be cooked over open flames or buried in coals, methods that required constant attention and frequent adjustment. Aldith used a crude iron pot with a tight-fitting lid, creating a makeshift oven that could be surrounded by coals to provide more even heating. The technique was imperfect, often resulting in burned bottoms or undercooked tops, but it represented the best compromise available given their resources. The timing of pie making in peasant households was determined by the availability of ingredients and the seasonal rhythms of agricultural life. February represented one of the few periods when peasants had sufficient stored resources to attempt elaborate cooking while having time available for extended food preparation. The winter months provided relief from the intensive labor of agricultural seasons, though they also brought the constant threat of food shortage as stored supplies dwindled toward the spring planting season. The social significance of peasant pie making extended beyond mere nutrition to encompass questions of dignity and cultural participation. Despite their poverty, Godwin and Aldith sought to create foods that resembled, however distantly, the elaborate dishes served in aristocratic households. Their pie represented an assertion of their humanity and their participation in the broader cultural traditions of their society, even though their resources severely limited their ability to achieve the standards they aspired to reach. As Aldith worked through the complex process of assembling ingredients and managing the cooking fire, you began to understand the profound challenges that faced the majority of medieval society in their daily struggle for adequate nutrition. The simple act of making a pie revealed the enormous gap between the culinary possibilities available to different social classes, while also demonstrating the ingenuity and determination that allowed peasant families to create meaning and satisfaction within the constraints of their circumstances. As the winter deepened and the family's food stores continued to diminish, Aldith's approach to pie making evolved into a sophisticated strategy for stretching limited resources while maintaining both nutrition and morale during the most challenging months of the peasant year. You observed the development of techniques that represented centuries of accumulated wisdom about survival in conditions of chronic scarcity, methods that had been refined through generations of women who understood that the difference between life and death often lay in the efficient utilization of every available resource. The management of ingredients required planning that extended months into the future, as each decision about current consumption affected the family's prospects for surviving until the next harvest. Aldith maintained a mental inventory of their remaining stores that was more precise than any written record, tracking not only quantities, but also the condition and expected shelf life of every preserved item in their possession. The peas that formed the foundation of their pie had to be allocated carefully, as they represented one of the few protein sources available during the late winter months when fresh food was non-existent. The techniques for extending the filling relied on intimate knowledge of local resources that could supplement their limited stores. Wild roots that had been gathered during the autumn months and stored in underground pits provided bulk and nutrition that stretched the more precious ingredients. Turnips and parsnips, vegetables that could survive winter storage, were diced and added to the filling, their sweetness providing flavor complexity while their fiber created a sense of fullness that helped satisfy hunger with smaller quantities of meat. The preservation methods employed by peasant households required constant attention and sophisticated understanding of food chemistry, though this knowledge was expressed through practical experience rather than theoretical understanding. Meat had to be kept in conditions that prevented spoilage while remaining accessible for cooking, a balance that required careful monitoring of temperature and humidity. The cottage's cool corners served as refrigeration, while the smoky atmosphere created by the central hearth provided antimicrobial properties that helped preserve food. The recycling of cooking materials represented another crucial aspect of peasant resource management. The fat rendered from cooking meat was carefully collected and saved for future use, as it provided both cooking medium and flavor enhancement for subsequent meals. Bones were never discarded but were boiled repeatedly to extract every trace of nutrition, creating broths that added liquid and flavor to the pie filling while providing essential minerals that might otherwise be lacking in the peasant diet. The adaptation of cooking techniques to available equipment required creativity and practical engineering skills. Without specialized baking tools, Aldith fashioned implements from available materials, using flat stones as baking surfaces and creating steam with wet cloths to improve the cooking environment. The iron pot that served as their oven was supplemented with improvised covers and heat reflectors that helped distribute temperature more evenly, though the results remained unpredictable and required constant attention. The timing of cooking activities had to be coordinated with other household responsibilities, as the peasant family could not afford the luxury of dedicating entire days to food preparation. Aldith worked on the pie during intervals between spinning wool, mending clothes, caring for children, and maintaining the household's other essential functions. The cooking process was interrupted frequently as other demands claimed her attention, requiring techniques that could tolerate irregular timing and variable heat levels. The economic calculations underlying peasant cooking were more complex than they appeared, involving trade-offs between immediate consumption and future security that required sophisticated understanding of risk and probability. Every ingredient used in the pie represented alternatives foregone. The peas could have been saved for lean periods later in the winter. The meat could have been preserved longer to extend its useful life. The fuel could have been conserved for essential heating during the coldest weather. Aldith's decisions reflected not only current needs but also her assessment of future conditions based on weather patterns, remaining stores, and the family's health status. The nutritional aspects of peasant pie making revealed both the limitations and the ingenuity of medieval subsistence cooking. The combination of peas, meat, and wild vegetables provided a more balanced nutritional profile than any individual ingredient could offer, demonstrating practical understanding of dietary needs that preceded scientific knowledge of nutrition by centuries. The cooking process itself enhanced the bioavailability of nutrients, while creating flavors that made monotonous winter meals more palatable and psychologically satisfying. The social dimensions of peasant cooking extended beyond the immediate family to encompass community relationships and mutual assistance networks. Neighbors shared ingredients when their individual stores ran low, creating informal systems of mutual insurance that helped families survive temporary shortages. The knowledge required for successful food preservation and preparation was transmitted through community networks, particularly among women who gathered to work on textile production or other communal activities. The religious aspects of food preparation provided spiritual framework that helped peasant families cope with the stress of chronic uncertainty about their survival. The blessing of food before consumption acknowledged divine providence while creating psychological comfort during times of scarcity. The sharing of food with neighbors and travelers, despite limited resources, fulfilled religious obligations, while building social capital that might prove essential during future crises. The seasonal rhythms that governed peasant life created cyclical patterns of abundance and scarcity that required careful management to smooth consumption throughout the year. The winter pie making represented one strategy for creating variety and maintaining morale during the most challenging season, when the monotony of preserved foods could lead to nutritional deficiencies and psychological depression. The effort invested in creating special meals during winter months served both practical and emotional needs that were essential for family survival. The technological constraints that limited peasant cooking options also fostered innovation and adaptation that demonstrated remarkable human ingenuity. The absence of specialized equipment required the development of multi-purpose tools and techniques that maximized utility while minimizing resource requirements. The solutions developed by peasant cooks influenced cooking methods throughout medieval society, as techniques proven effective under conditions of scarcity were often adopted by households with greater resources. The environmental factors that shaped peasant cooking included not only climate and seasons, but also the broader ecological relationships that governed rural life. The availability of wild foods depended on understanding complex ecological systems and seasonal patterns that required detailed local knowledge accumulated over generations. The management of domestic animals for food production required integration with agricultural cycles and careful attention to breeding, feeding, and health maintenance that represented sophisticated understanding of animal husbandry. As Aldith continued her patient work of creating sustenance from scarcity, her methods revealed the profound human capacity for adaptation and survival under conditions that would challenge modern understanding of minimum living standards. The pie that slowly took shape under her careful attention represented not only food but also hope, dignity, and the determination to maintain cultural traditions despite economic constraints that might have justified abandoning such aspirations. The completion of Aldith's pie coincided with the arrival of unexpected visitors whose presence would transform a simple family meal into a test of peasant hospitality and community solidarity. Old Marjorie, the village's unofficial keeper of wisdom and tradition, appeared at the cottage door accompanied by young Willem, whose parents had died during the previous harvest season, leaving him dependent on the charity of neighbors for survival. Their arrival created both opportunity and challenge for Godwin's family, as the obligation to share food conflicted with their own precarious situation. The customs governing peasant hospitality were both ancient and practical, reflecting centuries of experience with survival in conditions where mutual assistance could mean the difference between life and death. No one could be turned away from a cottage when food was being prepared, but neither could hosts be expected to sacrifice their family's survival for guests. The solution required careful negotiation and sophisticated understanding of community relationships that balanced individual needs with collective responsibility. Aldith's response to the unexpected guests revealed the complex social calculations that governed peasant life. Old Marjorie's presence represented both honor and burden. Her wisdom and experience made her a valued guest whose blessing could bring good fortune to the household, but her advanced age meant she no longer contributed significantly to the community's productive capacity. Willem's situation was different, as his youth and strength made him potentially valuable for future labor exchange, but his current dependence created immediate costs that the family could ill afford. The expansion of the meal to accommodate additional diners required techniques that had been developed specifically for such situations. Aldith added water to the pie filling, creating a thinner but more abundant mixture that could satisfy more people while reducing the nutritional density of each portion. Wild herbs were added in greater quantities to compensate for the dilution of flavors, while additional barley flour was used to thicken the mixture and create a greater sense of substance. The conversation during the meal preparation revealed the informal networks of information and assistance that bound the peasant community together. Old Marjorie brought news from other villages, reporting on crop conditions, weather patterns, and social developments that could affect everyone's survival prospects. Her knowledge of traditional remedies and seasonal indicators provided practical value that partially justified the food consumed during her visit. Willem contributed information about conditions at the manor house, where he had been working intermittently, providing intelligence about the Lord's plans and policies that could affect peasant obligations. The distribution of food during the meal followed protocols that acknowledged both social hierarchy and practical needs. Old Marjorie, despite her dependent status, received the choicest portions in recognition of her age and wisdom. Willem, as a young man capable of heavy labor, was given quantities adequate to maintain his strength for future work. Aldith and the women received smaller portions, reflecting both their lower caloric needs and their secondary status within the household hierarchy. The children's portions were carefully measured to provide adequate nutrition for growth, while conserving resources for the adults whose survival was essential for family continuation. The economic implications of the shared meal extended beyond the immediate costs to encompass longer-term relationships and obligations. Old Marjorie's blessing of the food and her expressions of gratitude created spiritual benefits that many peasants considered more valuable than material resources. Her prayers for the family's prosperity and protection provided psychological comfort that helped maintain morale during difficult times. Willem's presence created opportunities for future labor exchange, as his temporary dependence could be converted into obligations for assistance during busy agricultural seasons. The technological aspects of cooking for larger groups revealed both the flexibility and the limitations of peasant kitchen arrangements. The single iron pot had to accommodate larger quantities of food while maintaining adequate cooking temperatures, requiring careful management of fuel and heat distribution. The cooking time increased significantly with larger quantities, consuming additional precious fuel while requiring extended attention from Aldith. The serving of the meal required improvised dishes and utensils, as peasant households possessed minimal equipment for entertaining guests. The nutritional consequences of sharing scarce resources created challenges that required both immediate adaptation and longer-term planning. The reduced portions for family members meant that their nutritional reserves would be depleted more rapidly, potentially creating health problems if similar demands continued. Aldith compensated by planning to supplement their diet with wild foods that could be gathered during the following days, though this strategy depended on weather conditions and the availability of forage species that might already be over-harvested by other desperate families. The social functions of shared meals extended beyond mere hospitality to encompass the transmission of culture and the reinforcement of community bonds. Old Marjorie's presence provided opportunities for storytelling and the sharing of traditional knowledge that helped maintain cultural continuity during times of change. Willem's participation in family activities created surrogate kinship relationships that could provide security for him while offering the family additional labor resources in the future. The religious dimensions of food sharing reflected theological teachings about charity and community responsibility that provided moral framework for economic behavior. The obligation to feed the hungry was understood as divine commandment that superseded immediate self-interest, though the practical implementation of this principle required careful balance between spiritual obligations and survival needs. The blessing of shared food created sacred space within the humble cottage, transforming subsistence into communion and elevating material necessity into spiritual practice. The seasonal timing of the shared meal highlighted both the generosity and the risk involved in peasant hospitality during winter months. The family's willingness to share their carefully hoarded resources during the year's most challenging period demonstrated remarkable courage and community commitment, though it also increased their vulnerability to future shortages. The calculation of risk versus obligation required sophisticated understanding of probability and resources that reflected the complex decision-making skills required for peasant survival. The gender dynamics revealed through the meal preparation and service reflected both traditional role divisions and the practical realities of peasant life. Aldith's control over food preparation and distribution gave her significant authority within the household, as these decisions directly affected family survival and social relationships. Her management of resources and guests demonstrated skills that were essential for family survival, though these contributions often went unrecognized in formal social hierarchies that privileged male activities. The economic networks revealed through the evening's interactions demonstrated the complex web of relationships that sustained peasant communities during difficult periods. The informal systems of mutual assistance, labor exchange, and resource sharing created safety nets that helped individuals survive temporary crises while building social capital that enhanced long-term community resilience. These networks operated outside formal legal structures but were governed by customs and obligations that were understood and enforced through community pressure. The psychological impact of the shared meal provided benefits that extended far beyond its nutritional value. The opportunity to demonstrate hospitality enhanced the family's sense of dignity and social standing, counteracting the degrading effects of chronic poverty and dependence. The presence of guests transformed a simple subsistence meal into a social occasion that provided variety and stimulation during the monotonous winter months. The sharing of food created bonds of mutual obligation and affection that enriched the emotional life of all participants. The contrast between the peasant meal and the elaborate feasts of the wealthy was both stark and illuminating. While Lady Marguerite's guests had enjoyed exotic spices worth their weight in silver, Godwin's family shared simple ingredients that represented their most precious possessions. Yet both meals served similar social functions, creating relationships, demonstrating values, and reinforcing community bonds through the ancient ritual of shared food. The peasant feast lacked the luxury of aristocratic banquets, but it possessed its own dignity and significance within the context of village life. As the evening concluded with the distribution of remaining food and the arrangement of sleeping places for the guests, the long-term implications of the family's hospitality became apparent. Old Marjorie's blessing and Willem's gratitude created social capital that would generate future benefits, while the demonstration of generosity enhanced the family's reputation within the community. The immediate costs were significant, but the investment in relationships and social standing would provide returns that could prove essential for future survival. The winter night that settled over the cottage contained both the satisfaction of obligation fulfilled and the anxiety of resources depleted. Godwin and Aldith had honored the customs of their community and the teachings of their faith, but they had also reduced their margin of safety during the year's most dangerous season. Their decision reflected the complex moral calculations that define peasant life, where survival often depended on maintaining relationships that required sacrifice of immediate material interests. The lessons embedded in the evening's events would be remembered and transmitted to future generations, becoming part of the accumulated wisdom that enabled peasant communities to survive in conditions of chronic scarcity. The techniques for extending resources, the protocols for sharing food, and the understanding of social obligations would be passed down through families and communities, creating cultural knowledge that was as essential for survival as technical skills in agriculture or craft production. The pie that had brought the community together represented more than food. It embodied the human capacity for creating meaning, dignity, and connection even under conditions of extreme hardship. In a world where survival was never guaranteed and resources were chronically inadequate, the simple act of sharing a meal affirmed values that transcended immediate material concerns and maintained the social bonds that made survival possible. The story of peasant pie making in 1250 thus revealed both the harsh realities of medieval life and the remarkable resilience of human communities. The technical challenges of creating food from limited resources were matched by the social complexity of maintaining relationships and obligations that sustained communities through times of crisis. The humble pie that graced Godwin's table possessed its own form of nobility, representing achievements that were perhaps more remarkable than the exotic displays of aristocratic wealth, for they were accomplished not through abundance, but through the careful management of scarcity and the generous sharing of what little could be spared. As dawn broke over the villages and manor houses of medieval England in the year 1251, the smoke rising from countless hearths told the stories we have followed through these long winter nights. From Aldrich's patient turning of the millstones to Thomas's mastery of guild oven fires, from Lady Marguerite's spice-laden table to Aldith's humble but generous sharing, each thread in our tapestry revealed how the simple act of baking a pie connected every level of medieval society through bonds of necessity, tradition, and human ingenuity. The four stories we have explored represent more than mere historical curiosity. They illuminate the profound complexity that lay beneath what might appear to be the simplest of medieval activities. The transformation of grain into flour, the mysteries of dough and fire, the alchemy of precious spices, and the economics of survival all converged in the creation of pies that served not merely as food, but as expressions of social status, demonstrations of skill, vehicles for community building, and assertions of human dignity in the face of scarcity. Each story revealed different aspects of the same fundamental truth, that even the most basic human activities in medieval society were embedded in complex networks of relationships, technologies, and cultural meanings that connected individuals to their communities and their times. The miller's technical expertise, the baker's professional knowledge, the lady's access to global trade networks, and the peasant family's survival strategies all represented different responses to the same challenge of creating sustenance and meaning within the constraints of their medieval world. The winter of 1250-1251 that we have shared tested all of our protagonists in different ways, revealing both the fragility and the resilience of medieval social systems. Natural disasters, economic pressures, social obligations, and technological limitations created obstacles that required constant adaptation and innovation. Yet, through it all, the rhythm of daily life continued, sustained by the accumulated wisdom of generations who had learned to extract maximum value from limited resources while maintaining the social bonds that made survival possible. The pie, in all its variations from the coarsest peasant pastry to the most elaborate aristocratic creation, served as a window into a world where survival and dignity were daily achievements rather than assumed conditions. In our journey through medieval kitchens and dining halls, we have witnessed not only the technical processes of food preparation, but also the human dramas of ambition, obligation, creativity, and endurance that defined life in an age when tomorrow's bread was never guaranteed.